You are listening to Still Unanswered. I'm Maya Ellison. Before we begin, content warning. This episode discusses sexual violence, torture, murder, and references an audio recording of an assault that was played in court. We'll be restrained with graphic detail and keep our focus on victims, investigative failures, and systemic lessons. If you need a break at any point, please pause the episode. Today, the case known to history as the Toolbox Killers, Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. Aaron, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Maya. It's a heavy one. I think everyone who studies these cases carries part of it with them.
Yeah, let's start small, then widen out. In 5 months, in 1979, June to October, 2 men abducted, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 5 teenage girls in Southern California. They used items kept in a literal toolbox inside a van, pliers, ice picks, a sledgehammer, and they recorded at least part of one attack. That recording later moved people in court to tears. Those facts alone are unsettling.
Unsettling is right. But beyond the horror, the case forces us to ask how 2 men with documented violent histories were able to connect after prison and escalate to this level. That's part of what criminologists and, frankly, clinicians still puzzle over.
Before we get into the psychology, a little framing. Bittaker was born in 1940, Norris in 1948. Both had long histories of criminal behavior before they met at the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo in the mid-1970s. They allegedly planned, in prison, an elaborate series of abductions. They even discussed the mechanics, how to pick up girls along the Pacific Coast Highway, how to avoid witnesses, where to dump bodies in the San Gabriel Mountains. This was premeditated.
And that pre-planning is crucial. In risk assessment terms, premeditation shows organized, instrumental planning rather than impulsive opportunism. It also implies that the prison environment in which they met became a place where fantasy was rehearsed and normalized.
Which brings up one of the still unanswered refrains: system failure. Norris had spent 5 years in a Atascadero State Hospital as a mentally disordered sex offender and was declared no further danger upon release. He reoffended almost immediately. As someone who worked as a public defender, I've seen how assessments can fail, but this one haunts me. What does the clinical record tell you, Aaron?
Well, the label "no further danger" is, in practice, a predictive judgment based on then available data, but it's imperfect. Norris had a documented history of escalating sexual violence, attempted assaults, a brutal attack on a college student, the kind of pre-existing behavior that, in hindsight, marks a high risk of recidivism. Atascadero's evaluation standards in the 1970s were different, and there was less integration between hospital records and parole decisions. So you get risky releases.
Right. And Bittaker, older, in and out of institutions, intelligent, but described as cold and manipulative. Profiles later called him one of the most disturbing individuals an FBI profiler had seen. So you put these 2 together, it turned into mutual reinforcement rather than containment.
Exactly. In team-killing dynamics, you often see a dominant partner who delights in planning and control, and a second partner who is complicit, sometimes because of fear, sometimes because of shared deviance, and sometimes because of previous predispositions. Bittaker seems to have been the organizing force, the one who planned the perfect crime in prison, while Norris brought a history of sexual violence that made him willing to participate.
I want to pause there. I know people listening will ask, who was worse? We have to be careful. This isn't a competition of cruelty. Both men participated in repeated, brutal acts. The difference between them matters legally and for accountability, but morally and for victims' families, it doesn't lessen the harm. Aaron?
Agreed. Legally, one cooperating witness received a plea deal, but both materially caused suffering. From a clinical standpoint, understanding roles helps with prevention, identifying which offender traits are most likely to be amplified by co-offending. But it shouldn't be used to diminish one victim's experience.
Let's go chronological for listeners who may not be familiar with the sequence. They met at California Men's Colony. After their releases in 1978, they reunited in the Los Angeles area. Bittaker bought a silver 1977 GMC Vandura panel van, no side windows, nicknamed Murder Mac. They fitted it with a mattress, a sliding door, and a toolbox full of implements later used in the crimes. They practiced picking up girls. They rehearsed luring techniques. Then, from June to October 1979, 5 known girls disappeared or were murdered. I'll name them: Cindy Schaefer, Andrea Hall, Jackie Gilliam, Leah Lamp, and Shirley Lynette Ledford. 2 of those bodies were recovered. 2 were never found. Shirley's murder is particularly relevant because they recorded parts of it. Aaron, can you help unspool the victim's timeline and what it tells us about escalation?
I'll do my best. The first known victim, Cindy Schaefer, went missing June 24, 1979, 16 years old. Last seen leaving a church youth group in Redondo Beach. According to later testimony, she was abducted and taken into the San Gabriel Mountains. Her body was never recovered. Next, Andrea Hall, a waitress, 18, went missing July 8 while hitchhiking. She was abused, photographed, and murdered. Her remains were never found either. After a lull in August, which experts debate, was it planning, logistics, or unidentified victims, they abducted Jackie Gilliam and Leah Lamp in September. Both were found later as skeletal remains identified by dental records. Finally, on October 31, Halloween, Shirley Ledford was taken. She was tortured, and portions of that torture were audio recorded. That tape later became a centerpiece of Bittaker's trial.
And the tape, listeners should know, moved people to tears. Jurors, lawyers, court personnel left the courtroom during playback. Sheriff Peter Pitchess called the abuse sadistic and barbaric. We will not attempt to recreate or play that tape. We will, however, discuss its existence and how the justice system used it. Aaron, from a forensic point of view, what does the act of recording such an assault tell us about an offender?
Recording suggests several converging pathologies. One is narcissism, wanting to relive and preserve the crime as a trophy or a means of self-aggrandizement. Another is voyeuristic sadism, deriving sustained pleasure not only from the physical act, but from being able to repeatedly expose oneself to the victim's suffering. There's also a level of arrogance, the belief they would never be caught. And clinically, the creation of permanent evidence speaks to a compulsion beyond the immediate, an anticipatory and ritualistic component.
Those are helpful distinctions, and they have legal consequences. The tape became evidence of torture and premeditation. But there's an ethical question I want to put to you, Aaron. Should tapes like this ever be played in open court? They re-traumatize families and may prejudice jurors, yet they convey the gravity of the crime. How do courts weigh that?
Courts traditionally evaluate admissibility through relevance versus prejudicial impact. The tape was relevant. It showed the manner of the crime, the intent, the cruelty, elements that are critical in death penalty cases. But judges also must consider whether its emotional impact unfairly biases a jury beyond the probative value. In Bittaker's trial, prosecutors argued the tape was necessary to prove especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel conduct to secure the death sentence. The emotional reaction was anticipated, but so was the legal standard. It's a painful balance, truth and proof versus the risk of sensationalism.
And for listeners, that's one of the darker tensions of true crime storytelling. We want to be truthful. We also must avoid turning suffering into spectacle. Switching gears, how did investigators ultimately catch them?
It came down to what we'd call a human intelligence break. Norris had been bragging to friends, acquaintances about his involvement. One of those people became alarmed and tipped off police. Surveillance followed. Officers observed associational patterns and located a van matching composite descriptions. Parole violations gave them a legal foothold. When they searched Bittaker's van and motel room, they found Polaroids, souvenirs that matched items reported missing by families, and the toolbox. They also found the audio tape. Those physical links, combined with Norris's eventual confession, sealed the case.
Norris confessed, then took a plea deal, 45 years to life in exchange for testifying against Bittaker and avoiding the death penalty. He provided detailed accounts of the 5 murders and helped guide searches. 2 remains, Jackie and Leah, were later found and identified. Cindy and Andrea's remains were never recovered despite searches, and years later, Bittaker would give a map to criminologist Laura Brandt indicating possible burial spots. Law enforcement searched again, but no definitive recovery. That lack of recovery leaves families without closure. Aaron, how common is it for co-offenders to flip and then later change their story?
Quite common, unfortunately. Offenders often use confessions strategically. Norris's trial testimony was detailed, likely motivated by the plea deal to avoid execution. Later, he attempted to minimize his role, claiming blackouts, being high on drugs, positioning Bittaker as the primary sadist. This is a known pattern, what we call impression management. Offenders calibrate their narratives to minimize culpability when the immediate leverage, like a deal, is gone. That doesn't mean their initial statements are false, but it does require interrogators and courts to corroborate with physical evidence.
I want to linger on the parole and hospital decisions a bit. As a former public defender, I sat on many parole boards and argued cases where predictions about future danger were uncertain. In the 1970s, psychiatric tools and record sharing were less sophisticated, but Norris's release after Atascadero still feels like a major, tragic miscalculation. Aaron, what would modern practice look like? Would he have been kept longer? Or are we talking about structural limits?
Both. Modern risk assessment includes actuarial tools, static and dynamic risk factors, structured professional judgment instruments like the Static 99 for sexual offenders. They would have flagged a high-risk profile. But we also operate within legal constraints. Indefinite civil commitment requires a higher threshold and robust due process. In some jurisdictions, someone like Norris might be subject to sexually violent predator civil commitment post-sentence. In others, not. So improvements in assessment could have identified him as high risk, but whether he would have been detained longer is a legal and policy question.
So it's not just clinical, it's legal and societal. Okay, let's look at the trial of Bittaker. He was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 1981. He appealed, but the California Supreme Court upheld the sentence. He remained on death row until he died in 2019. Norris, who testified against him, served his life term and died in 2020. For many listeners, that raises the question, did justice unfold the way it was intended? A man sentenced to death died of natural causes decades later. A cooperating killer got a life term. Thoughts?
Justice is complex. From a retributive standpoint, a death sentence that never executes may feel unsatisfying. From a utilitarian or systemic perspective, securing a conviction against one of the perpetrators, particularly the one painted as the more dominant actor, via a plea deal with another, can be seen as pragmatic. But you must also consider the moral cost. Does bargaining away the possibility of maximum punishment for one offender undermine faith in the system? It's a tension between achieving a certain kind of certainty and conviction and pursuing maximal punishment.
And there's the family's perspective. Some felt betrayed by the deal, others relieved it ensured a conviction. On another line, the case is a textbook for team killers, a dynamic criminologist's study for prevention. Aaron, can you walk listeners through what makes team killers different from lone serial killers and what we learn from this pair?
Team killers involve interpersonal dynamics that produce escalation. Often, the partnership creates a feedback loop. One offers ideas, the other provides the means or psychological fuel. In the toolbox case, Bittaker appears to have been the architect. Norris had prior sexual violence. The pairing allowed fantasies to become plans. From a prevention standpoint, it emphasizes the danger of high-risk associations after release and the need for supervision that looks beyond isolated offender risk to networked risk. That is, who are offenders spending time with once they're back in the community?
That's a vital point. Supervision models often monitor individuals, but not the dangerous alliances that can form. Let's talk about the Polaroids and unidentified photos found in Bittaker's possessions. Some of those images have never been linked to victims. Could there be more victims? How does the unknown number of victims weigh into investigations and family closure?
It's always possible. Unidentified photographs are troubling because they may represent additional assaults, consensual interactions, or subjects who never reported crimes. Investigators often use dental records, missing person reports, and family inquiries to identify subjects. But even with modern DNA and facial recognition, cold case identification is hard. The unknown number amplifies trauma for families, and it can complicate prosecutions. Without bodies or corroborating evidence, prosecutors make tough choices about whether to pursue additional counts.
And that circles back to evidence preservation and modern methods. In the 1970s, investigators didn't have the DNA toolkit we have now. Some items were preserved. Polaroids, clothing, the tape, and those artifacts keep the case alive. Yet the tape raises another ethical question. Should recordings be preserved indefinitely or destroyed after use? Obviously, police must keep evidence, but the existence of a macabre artifact like that creates a responsibility. Who should control access? Is there guidance here?
Legally, evidence is preserved, especially in major violent cases. Chain of custody protocols are strict. Ethically, access should be tightly controlled, restricted to investigators, defense counsel, and court, and only reproduced under strict conditions. Some argue for eventual destruction to avoid misuse. Others say preserving evidence can be crucial for future identification, appeals, or forensics. There's no simple answer. The principle should be to minimize re-traumatization while preserving the possibility of justice.
Listeners, I want to remind you that both Bittaker and Norris died of natural causes. Bittaker in 2019, Norris in 2020. So many of our questions about motives or unrevealed victims went without final judicial closure. Laura Brand, a criminologist who engaged with Bittaker and Norris over years, collected interviews, and even a map Bittaker made late in life suggesting where Schaefer and Hall might be buried. Law enforcement researched those areas and found nothing conclusive. Aaron, does late-life cooperation from offenders often help cold cases?
It can. Some offenders, near the end of life, seek to offload secrets, maybe for attention, to manipulate, or perhaps as guilt. Late confessions can yield leads, but their credibility is mixed. Memories can be distorted, and offenders may conflate events or invent details. For investigators, any new information requires corroboration. Searches, cross-referencing with earlier statements, geographic profiling. Sometimes it helps, other times it's a dead end that reopens wounds.
And it raises another real question I want to put bluntly. How many failures, clinical, legal, administrative, stacked here to allow these men to do what they did? We saw parole releases, poor information sharing, and maybe missed patterns of associational risk. Is this a unique failure or a structural problem we still face?
Both. The Toolbox case had unique elements, but many of its root causes are structural. Under-resourced mental health systems, inconsistent information flow between institutions, and parole systems that sometimes prioritize release over public safety. We've made improvements, better assessment instruments, databases, interagency communication, but gaps remain, especially in monitoring high-risk offenders who form dangerous partnerships.
When I represented clients on parole hearings, I loved to believe the system could be rehabilitative. But cases like this make me, cautious. There's also a political dimension, community pressure, media, and the death penalty side debates. The death sentence was imposed, but judicial delays and appeals meant Bittaker died of natural causes. Some see this as a failure of capital punishment as a policy. Others see it as the legal system working. How do you parse that?
Parsing the death penalty involves law, ethics, and empirical data. From an empirical perspective, extensive appeals in capital cases are common, which delays execution. Some argue these delays make the death penalty functionally obsolete. Others argue the appeals process protects against wrongful execution. In this case, the delay meant the state never carried out the sentence. For victims' families, that can feel like an incomplete form of justice. So the debate is as much about values as process.
We also have to talk about language. Media dubbing them the Toolbox Killers. That nickname is shorthand and evokes horror, but it risks turning victims into headlines. In this series, we try to center victims: Cindy, Andrea, Jackie, Leah, and Shirley. We keep their names in the conversation. It's important. Aaron, can you speak to how the victims' ages, mostly teens, shaped public reaction and investigation?
Teenage victims intensify public outrage for several reasons. The perception of vulnerability and innocence compounds the horror. Law enforcement faces more pressure to act quickly, but pressure can also lead to rushed conclusions or fear-driven policies. Investigators must balance urgency with methodical evidence collection. Public interest can spur resources, but can also distort priorities if not managed well.
A listener question that often comes up in my inbox. Given what we now know about Bittaker and Norris, that they practiced, photographed, and recorded, what practical steps could have prevented them from connecting after parole? In other words, what's the prevention checklist?
Good question. Some practical steps. 1. Better post-release supervision with attention to associations. Parole officers actively monitoring who high-risk offenders are spending time with. 2. Shared databases among hospitals, parole boards, and police to flag concerning histories. 3. Mandatory reporting or restrictions on contact with known violent offenders. 4. Community notification systems that are targeted. 5. Improved civil commitment protocols for sexually violent predators. None of these are panaceas, but together they reduce risk.
But each measure raises civil liberty questions. We have to respect due process while trying to prevent harm. It's a messy policy equation.
It is. You need proportionality, interventions matched to risk, legal safeguards, periodic review, and evidence-based thresholds. Overbroad confinement risks injustice. Underprotection risks more victims. The hard part is designing systems that are humane and effective.
Let's move to the cultural side for a minute. This case has been the subject of documentaries and books, and it often pops up in law enforcement training as an example of team killers and handling extreme evidence. But there's a recurring ethical concern. How do we cover such stories without sensationalizing trauma? My approach has always been trauma-informed. Avoid gratuitous detail, keep victims centered, and talk about systems. Aaron, any thoughts on responsible coverage?
Responsible coverage should foreground victims, avoid lurid detail, and include context, policy, prevention, systemic failure. Forensic detail can be necessary for understanding, but it should be used sparingly and with triggers clearly signaled. Including voices of survivors, family members, and experts who can explain systemic lessons can transform a sensational story into a teachable one.
That's exactly what we aim for on Still Unanswered. Before we get to some of the lingering questions, I want to ask you, Aaron, about the psychological legacy. Does studying cases like this change how clinicians are trained, or how risk assessors think about fantasy rehearsal in institutional settings?
Yes, these cases highlight the need to take fantasy, especially collaborative fantasy, seriously. Clinicians assessing incarcerated offenders must evaluate not only individual pathology, but also how inmates influence one another. Correctional treatment programs now often include modules on co-offender influence, network analysis, and the management of deviant communities within prison. The field recognizes that prisons can be incubators for certain behaviors if not supervised.
That's a painful irony. Institutions meant to rehabilitate can become places where dangerous collusion forms. We don't have unlimited time, but we have to cover the unanswered pieces. First, 2 bodies were never recovered. We have a map from Bittaker late in life. Searches were conducted. Nothing definitive. Second, unidentified women in the Polaroids. Third, Norris's shifting narratives. Fourth, the ethical cost of the plea deal. Let's take them in order. Unrecovered bodies. For families, not having a body it's a permanent wound. Aaron, how do investigators prioritize renewed searches decades later?
Cold case units weigh credibility of new leads, the potential for discovery given environmental change, and resource allocation. If a lead, like Bittaker's map, has sufficient specificity and the terrain is searchable, they'll try again. But mountains shift, erosion happens, animals scatter remains. Over decades, recovery probability declines. Still, even remote chance is often worth pursuing for families' closure.
Polaroids and unidentified subjects. Those images keep haunting the case. With today's facial recognition and DNA databases, is there a realistic chance of identifying those women now?
Possibly. Modern forensic methods can sometimes match images to missing person databases or social media profiles with appropriate legal authorization. DNA extraction from photographs is trickier, but not impossible if biological material is present. However, privacy and legal considerations are complex, and not every jurisdiction has the resources to do exhaustive image analysis.
Norris's shifting narratives, trial testimony versus later minimization, are, as you said, classic impression management. For victims and families, that feels like betrayal. Legally, he cooperated and avoided death. Ethically, the deal sits uneasily. From your experience, is there a better way to handle co-offender deals in such cases?
There's no easy better in every case. One approach is transparency, clearly communicating to families why the deal was necessary and what limits exist. Another is tying cooperation to demonstrable actions, full disclosure leading to recovery of remains, for example. But bargaining away capital punishment in exchange for testimony often remains a pragmatic choice when it's the clearest path to convict the primary offender.
That's painfully pragmatic. Finally, the death penalty. Bittaker was sentenced to die, but decades of appeals and legal stays meant he remained on death row until he died naturally. For some, that feels like the law worked. Appeals protected rights. For others, it's an institutional failure. I'm curious, what do you tell students when you use cases like this in class?
I tell students to separate process from outcome. The justice system is about procedures meant to ensure fairness, which inevitably takes time in capital cases. But we must also ask whether the delays serve justice or merely prolong suffering. The case is a useful vehicle to discuss the goals of punishment, retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation, and whether the death penalty achieves them.
All right, let's end with what listeners can take away. Practical, reflective points. I'll offer 3, and Aaron, you add yours. First, names matter. We remember Cindy, Andrea, Jackie, Leah, and Shirley by name because anonymity erases victims. Second, systems need better mechanisms to detect dangerous associations among released offenders. Third, evidence preservation is crucial. Those Polaroids and that tape are double-edged, but they also helped secure convictions. Aaron?
I would add, 1. Invest in evidence-based risk assessment and ensure legal structures match clinical recommendations. 2. Maintain strong trauma-informed victim services. Families need more than convictions. They need long-term support. 3. Teach the public about the complexity of justice, so simplifications, why wasn't he locked up, are met with informed policy discussions rather than only outrage.
Good. And a final human note. If you are listening and this episode brings up something personal, trauma, memory, fear, please consider pausing, reaching out to a trusted person, or calling a support line in your country. Aaron, any closing thoughts before we wrap?
Only that cases like this remind us why interdisciplinary work matters. Psychology, law enforcement, mental health, and policy must coordinate. And we must keep asking difficult questions because the cost of complacency is real.
Thank you, Aaron. For those who want to read more, we used public records, reporting from CBS and Newsweek, and the criminology literature. We'll link to resources in the episode notes, including trauma support resources. Next week, Still Unanswered will examine another case where system gaps left questions, this time focusing on emergency custody decisions. If you value the work we do, consider supporting the show. Details in the notes. Above all, remember the human beings at the center of these stories.
Thanks, Maya. For anyone researching further, I can recommend a few academic articles on co-offending dynamics, and Laura Brand's work was particularly informative about Bittaker and Norris.
Good to know. Okay, one last thing. People will ask about the tape again. We won't play it here, and we won't link it. The fact of its existence and its use in court are part of the record. We respect that and the families by not reproducing it. This episode of Still Unanswered was hosted and written by me, Maya Ellison, with our guest, Dr. Aaron Villanueva. Production credits in the notes. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves.